Hi, my name is John Duplice, and I'm out of the Center for Language Education and Research at Sophia University in Tokyo. Thanks for coming to the presentation. This is going to describe a small pilot project I did about in 2020, right when COVID came in, so a lot of changes happened during this. But it looked at L2 vocabulary retention efficacy and the generation effect. And then I'll go into what the generation effect is in the presentation. But basically, it's a memory project looking at how this effect or this different treatments using generation and other treatments would affect longer term memory of vocabulary. So it's based off of Soderstrom and Bjork's work on the difference between performance and learning. And in this presentation, these terms are maybe a little bit different than what you're normally thinking of. So performance would be considered soon after instruction or being able to perform immediately after practice. The difference with learning is considered to be more permanent, being able to perform many weeks later or even months later. So in communication or in language learning, you can think of performance as cramming for a test where you just memorize a whole bunch of vocabulary, you take the test, you do fairly well on the test, and then you forget it all. Okay, so you can perform for the test, but you may not have learned for long term. Another example would be the fluency effect, where you can do the activities, you can do the practice immediately after studying, and you feel like you know it, therefore you feel like you're fluent in it, or your teacher believes you're fluent in it, but actually you're not. And that's known as the fluency effect or the fluency fallacy. Learning, on the other hand, would being able to use the material many weeks later, to recall it many weeks later after not using the material for, say, 5, 6, 7 weeks, being able to transfer the content or the material into new learning, and to, of course, recall it when necessary and on demand. So this is based off the desirable difficulties theory, and it was coined by Bjork back in the early 90s, and he was out of UCLA. And so basically, there's strategies in education that make something more challenging to enhance the learning process. So common uses in language learning are spaced repetition. A lot of people have heard of that. Retrieval practice. It's also known as testing, and that, but a lot of people don't like to use the term testing as much anymore because it has kind of a negative connotation. So retrieval, things like flashcards, or maybe trying to retrieve after you what the story was about after you read it. Generation is a little bit different. It's also desirable difficulty, but it requires you to generate content yourself. So, for example, if you were to read a passage, and instead of just retrieving what the passage is about, maybe you have to generate, okay, what's an example in my own life? And you have to generate your own kind of story or a couple sentences about that. Another example would be the generation is you learn a vocabulary word and you have some example sentences, but now you have to generate your own sentences connected to your own life. So the idea is that the L2 comparison, or the effect on L2 vocabulary and retention, the literature supports a few things and doesn't support others, and it's a little bit of a mixed bag. So it supports L2 comparison of enhancement and techniques. There's been a couple studies on this. L2 word list versus sentence generation. There's been a number of studies with this. Here, just memorizing a list versus actually generating sentences, which is similar to what I used here in this study. And elaboration and vocabulary learning. So having to go beyond just the basic words themselves. It doesn't support as much with the literature, and these are some examples of synonym generation studies. So Barcroft's done a number of studies in this area, and with mixed results, and it's not as clear. Sentence writing and semantic elaboration, and so sometimes people write sentences, and then can they elaborate with the semantics and such? But the problem is, a lot of times is, well, how long are the sentences? Are they connected to the person? Are they not connected to the person? So there's so much variability, it's really hard to pin it down sometimes. And then, of course, L2 vocabulary learning strategies. These are just a few studies on both sides, just to show you some examples of how it's a little bit unclear still. So my research question specifically was, what effect does the generation desirable difficulty have on long-term retention of L2 vocabulary among Japanese university students? The students I worked with were all freshmen, first-year students. Okay, they're first-year university students, ELLs in Japan. They were between the B1 to B1 plus level, and then the non-Japanese majors, so non-English majors. None of them were studying English or taking lots of English classes. This was their core English class. They were global studies majors, foreign language studies such as French, Portuguese, different languages such as that. There were also history majors and a few others, but no English majors. They were all L1 Japanese, so there were a handful of students who may have studied abroad briefly, but they were all L1 Japanese students. The couple of students who were not L1, who came from other countries, were excluded from the study. Although they did the study, but they weren't included in the data. The pilot study, which was experiment 1, and originally it wasn't supposed to be a pilot study, but with COVID I had to make quite a few adjustments, so I turned it into a pilot experiment. Here I'm using interchangeably between pilot study and experiment 1. Originally there were 56 participants, 42 females, 14 males, and then in experiment 2 there were 42 participants, 25 females, and 17 males. The pilot experiment was done in semester 1 in the spring semester, and experiment 2 was done in the second semester. The settings were online via Zoom and Moodle. So they were not on-demand classes. They were synchronous online classes. So they were live. We were all together. And the experiments duration lasted 6 weeks, both in the spring and then 6 weeks in the fall. To place the students, normally we use the TEEP test for in-person placement in different levels. Because of COVID, we had to do an online test. We used the CASIC test, and students were put into levels with this. There were 3 first-year compulsory English classes, all the same, estimated at the same level in the exact same class. So the pilot study used Paul Nation's work quite a bit, as well as the experiment 2, but we used the 4,000 Essential English Words, second edition, and on level 4. And then we used the academic word list, or I used the academic word list that was estimated to be at the B2 level. Experiment 2, I bumped it up a little bit, and I used the same series, but I used level 6, estimated to be at the C1 level. And the students were different classes. There were different classes. There may have been a few students that overlapped, but for the most part, they were different classes or different students. So what I did is I prepared 3 vocabulary lessons. So there was a 20 target vocabulary given with definitions in English. All of them had this. They all had a reading activity following this and a post-reading comprehension question activity. So those were the same across all treatments, across all of the lessons. The treatments varied though. So the first treatment, only 1 vocabulary definition in English was provided. So only the vocabulary definition in English. They couldn't use a dictionary or anything else. That just they could only use what was given. Next was a vocabulary definition was given, the same definition as the previous treatment, but they were allowed to use a bilingual dictionary if they wished, and most students did. And finally, the treatment using the generation activity was a vocabulary definition and additional sentence generation activity with target vocabulary. No dictionaries were allowed with this. So they had to use, they got the definition, same as before, the English definition provided, but they had to generate a sentence at the end following the reading comprehension questions of their own for each vocabulary word. There were 3-day and 3-week post-tests, so they had the lesson, let's say, on a Monday, and they're twice-a-week classes, so I had a lesson on a Monday, and then on Thursday, they would have a 3-day post-test, and that would be kind of the performance evaluation. And then 3 weeks later from then, they would have another post-test to see how much they remembered. So the treatments work like this. There was a group A, a group B, and a group C. And you can see how they just kind of rotated. So every group had each lesson, each treatment one time. So that way it was kind of evened out that way, and so it helped a little bit with the chance that maybe one was too easy or not. So all of the lessons were basically at the same level. They were all graded or rated at either B2 or C1 vocabulary level as best you can, although that's up for debate a little bit as well. During the pilot test, there was not a pre-test given. They were expected to understand from their level. During the post-test or the experiment 2, a pre-test was given. So treatments and topics. So social media, enhanced weathering, and the bachelor's lesson. So social media, SNS in Japan. Enhanced weathering, pretty weathering and weather aspects. The bachelor's lesson was not about a bachelor's degree. So it's more about learning how to the bachelor's life and such. So group A had a definition the first time. The second, group B had dictionary, group C generation, and then we just switched with each one. So the Pylon experiment results show the definition, or what I consider to be the baseline score, of a 1.926 standard deviation. So nothing major. Nothing major with any of these. You'll notice that most of the scores were pretty close without anything standing out. In fact, the 3-day base scores are almost exactly the same with no difference at all. The 3-week test score as well, not much difference here either. So I was wondering, well, what did I do? Was it because the words were too easy? Were the students cheating? So I made some adjustments from the pilot to the second experiment. And you'll see some adjustments here. Oops, sorry about that. So the pilot, I gave them 15 minutes for each post-test, both 3-day and 3-week. During the experiment 2, I reduced it to 10 minutes. That way they couldn't go back through and kind of play with the answers a little bit and try to guess. There was no pre-test in the pilot, but in the experiment 2, I did give them a pre-test of similar vocabulary from the same source. I got the vocabulary for the C1 level from Paul Nation's book, but not the same vocabulary. So basically it was a different chapter I used. I didn't want to use the same exact vocabulary because I didn't want to them to be familiar with the words before the lesson. And then vocabulary level B2 from the pilot, changed the vocabulary to C1 for the experiment 2. And then the multiple choice answers, were given 4 possible answers in the pilot study or experiment 1. This, I think the students were able to kind of figure out a little bit. They're really good at test taking sometimes, especially in Japan. So I changed it to a large list of 25 answers to choose from with extra choices. And then they had to choose from a large list with only 10 minutes. So it really was much more difficult in experiment 2. And you'll see some differences here between the two. So the pretest baseline score had a standard deviation of 2.144 for all of them. And then, so basically they got, a 5.5 points on average out of 20, and such, out of 20 questions. The 3-day test score for the definition baseline, 2.59. So a little bit of difference here from the first one. The dictionary, you'll see 1.98, and the generation 2.30 in the 3-day test score. In the 3-week test score, there was some change. So you'll see somewhat of a difference here between them, with especially the dictionary showing a drop-off from 17.17 average score to 15.34. So they lost about 2 points, almost 2 points from using the dictionary. So it was strong in the 3-day, but it drifted off, which makes sense according to the theory. If it's easier to use a dictionary, they can quickly do it, but it doesn't require the difficulty, the desirable difficulty, therefore it won't stick as long. The generation showed less reduction, but not a lot. It wasn't a huge, and it was barely significant statistically significant, but not enough to make a claim. And here's a chart that shows kind of the difference here. You'll see from the pink line is the 3-week, the blue line is the 3-day post-tests, and then the VDEF was the vocabulary and definition, VDict okay, vocabulary dictionary okay, and the VGen is the vocabulary and generation effect. And you can see by the gap and such where the dictionary treatment dropped quite a bit more than all the others. And such. So it went from, you look at the top of the blue line up here, and it comes all the way down here. And that's the biggest change, which makes sense because this was the easiest for the students to do, therefore had the less desirable difficulty effect. The definition had almost no change at all. And then the generation had a little bit of change, not as much as this. So some core variables were also checked: class period, gender, and faculty, and none of them showed any significant effects on the model and such. It also is important to know that the students, when they had to do the treatment of the extra 10 minutes for doing the writing activities, the writing the sentences for the generation, they get 10 more minutes into there as well. So the discussion of the results, the generation slightly improved the model, but not in a statistically significant way. And the results suggest negative effect from bilingual dictionary use on long-term retrieval and such, but there more studies need to be done on this, or more work needs to be done to make sure. And then the co-variables, class, time, gender, faculty, did not show any significant effect on the model. Now, the reason we used class time, or I used class time originally, was that we were planning to be face-to-face. And I was thinking that possibly first period class would have more of an effect coming just in from the train, or maybe class just in the late afternoon, maybe the students would be tired. But because we were online, that could have been a reason why that had no effect. And then I was not able to repeat changes to experiment 2 in a follow-up study. So that was one caveat that has to be taken into effect. So another problem was that the online format limited my ability to proctor the tests. So as many times I told them, you don't have to worry, it's not going to affect your grade, please don't cheat, I had no way to verify it that they did not cheat and such. So that's one issue. Normally I don't think they would, but it's hard to say for sure. Another aspect of this was that we were on Zoom, and if a student had maybe dropped out because of Zoom and had to log back in, a couple students couldn't, maybe they had to start the test over again, but I was cognizant of the time. It didn't happen much during the quizzes, and we took all the quizzes on Moodle, but it did happen a couple of times, and so I had to adjust, okay, finish this in 2 minutes and then manually do it with the student. So that's it for this study. I'm hoping to do the study again next year when we are 100% face-to-face, where I can have a little more control and also maybe make some more adjustments, doing a 2-semester study with a pretest at the beginning, and perhaps some more length between, instead of 6 weeks, making it 8 weeks as well. If you have any questions, feel free to email me at duplice@outlook.com, and I thank you very much for listening.